The silver Lexus pulled into the driveway of the 8-bedroom mansion on Secretariat Drive just after midnight. Inside the car, Salvatore Gravano reached for his cell phone, the same phone he'd been using all day to coordinate deliveries, confirm payments, and check in with the crew. He had no idea that every word he'd spoken had been recorded. He didn't know that 47 law enforcement officers were reviewing surveillance footage of his movements that very moment, preparing warrants, loading weapons, and synchronizing watches. In less than 6 hours, the sun would rise over the Tempe Hills, bathing the terracotta stucco in golden light, and this life he'd carefully built in the Arizona desert would shatter into 1,000 pieces. The man who had betrayed John Gotti, who had testified for 9 days in federal court about 19 murders he'd committed, who had brought down the most powerful crime family in America, was about to learn that you can never really escape your past. Not when you're Sammy the Bull Gravano, and certainly not when you've made the catastrophic mistake of building a drug empire in your own backyard. February 24th, 2000. The raid began at exactly 6 a.m. Phoenix police and DEA agents surrounded properties across the metropolitan area in a coordinated strike that had taken months to plan. At the Secretariat Drive home, officers approached the heavy front door while others took positions at every exit. Inside, Gravano was asleep. His wife Deborah, from whom he'd been divorced for 4 years but who still lived in the house, was in another room. Their 27-year-old daughter Karen and 24-year-old son Gerard were also on the property. None of them heard the vehicles pulling up. None of them expected what came next. The battering ram hit the door 3 times before it gave way. Agents poured into the house shouting commands, weapons drawn, moving room to room with the precision of a military operation. They found Gravano in his bedroom, scrambling to understand what was happening, reaching for clothes while officers barked orders. In the kitchen, they discovered stacks of cash. In the garage, more cash. In a bedroom, ecstasy pills still in their packaging. By the time the sun fully rose over the Arizona desert, Gravano was in handcuffs, being led past his pool with its custom waterfall, past his stables, past everything he'd bought with blood money from another life, and he was asking the one question he couldn't believe he had to ask. How did this happen? The answer began 8 years earlier in a federal courtroom in Brooklyn, where Salvatore Gravano made a decision that would define the rest of his life. On March 2nd, 1992, he walked to the witness stand in United States District Court and raised his right hand to swear an oath to tell the truth. Sitting across the courtroom, staring at him with barely contained fury, was John Gotti, the Dapper Don, the most famous mobster in America, the man Gravano had served as underboss for 6 years. For the next 9 days, Gravano would testify about their life together in the Gambino crime family. He described murders in clinical detail. He explained how they killed Paul Castellano outside Sparks Steakhouse on December 16, 1985, gunning down the boss and his bodyguard Thomas Bellotti in rush hour traffic. He revealed the inner workings of the Gambino family, their businesses, their territories, their rules. He admitted to 19 murders he'd personally committed or helped coordinate. He named names, provided dates, drew diagrams, and with every word he hammered another nail into Gotti's coffin. The testimony was devastating. Defense attorneys tried to break him, to catch him in contradictions, to paint him as a liar, desperate to save his own skin. But Gravano never wavered. He spoke in a deadpan voice, emotionless, matter-of-fact, as if describing something as mundane as grocery shopping rather than the systematic murder of human beings. 9 days. That's how long it took Salvatore Gravano to destroy the American Mafia's most powerful organization. The jury convicted Gotti on April 2nd, 1992. All 13 counts, 5 murders, racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, judged for worse. Leo Glasser sentenced him to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Gotti was sent to the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, where he would spend the rest of his days in virtual solitary confinement. He died there of throat cancer on June 10, 2002, at age 61, never forgiving the man who betrayed him. But Sammy the Bull had made his deal. In exchange for his cooperation, prosecutors agreed to recommend leniency. Despite confessing to 19 murders, Gravano was sentenced on September 26, 1994, to just 5 years in prison. He'd already served 4 years while awaiting trial, which meant his sentence amounted to less than a year, 3 months for each murder. It was, by any measure, the deal of the century, and it came with another crucial component: witness protection. The federal government would give Salvatore Gravano a new identity, a new life, and a chance to disappear. There was just one problem. The Gambino crime family had placed a $1 million bounty on his head. Every mobster in America wanted him dead, and Sammy the Bull had just ensured that he could never, ever return to New York. They sent him to Colorado first, sometime in 1994 after his release. He was given the name Jimmy Moran. It was supposed to be temporary, just long enough for the heat to die down, for people to forget, for the news cycle to move on to something else. But Gravano hated it. He hated the anonymity, the restrictions, the constant oversight from U.S. Marshals who monitored his every move. He'd spent his entire adult life as someone important, someone feared, someone who commanded respect. Now he was nobody, just another middle-aged man in a nothing town, told to keep his head down and be grateful he wasn't dead. He lasted 8 months. In 1995, against the advice of federal authorities, Salvatore Gravano left the Witness Protection Program. He gathered his family, his wife Deborah, who he'd married in 1971, his daughter Karen, who was 23, his son Gerard, who was 20, and he told them they were moving to Arizona, Phoenix, a sprawling, newly built city in the desert where the sun shone 300 days a year and where, he convinced himself, nobody would recognize him, where he could start over, where he could build legitimate businesses and live a normal life. It was a fantasy, of course, but in that moment, driving west with his family, away from the suffocating grip of witness protection, Sammy the Bull must have believed it was possible. The house on Secretariat Drive cost $650,000. It sat on 1.5 acres in an upscale section of Tempe, near Elliott Road and McClintock Drive, in a neighborhood of similar sprawling properties occupied by doctors, lawyers, and business owners. The house itself was magnificent by suburban standards. 8 bedrooms spread across 4,400 square feet of living space, a pool with a custom waterfall that burbled 24 hours a day, stables for horses, a 3-car garage, a separate guest apartment, terracotta, stucco exterior that glowed orange in the desert sunset. It was everything Gravano thought he wanted, a far cry from the cramped Brooklyn apartments of his youth, from the blood-spattered social clubs, from the paranoid midnight meetings in parking lots. This was respectability, or at least the appearance of it. Deborah moved in first, along with Karen and Gerard. Sammy kept a separate apartment for himself in another part of Tempe, a modest cinder block unit that cost him $620 a month. He told people it was for convenience, for privacy. In truth, his marriage to Deborah was already falling apart. The strain of the trial, of the testimony of becoming the most hated man in mob history, had taken its toll. She would file for divorce in 1996, though they would continue to have business dealings, and she would continue living in the Secretariat Drive house. But in those early days, 1995 and 96, there was still the illusion of a fresh start. Gravano threw himself into legitimate business with the enthusiasm of a man trying to prove something to himself. He opened Creative Pools, a swimming pool installation company. He bought brand new trucks, hired workers, invested in heavy equipment. The company's logo was emblazoned on the sides of the vehicles. He drove around Tempe in a flashy Lexus, meeting with potential customers, bidding on jobs, playing the role of honest entrepreneur. His wife Deborah opened Uncle Sal's Italian Ristorante in Scottsdale, a family-owned establishment with wood-paneled walls and a slogan that would later seem darkly ironic: the best-kept secret in Scottsdale. The restaurant served classic Italian cuisine, red sauce and pasta, the kind of food Gravano had grown up eating in Brooklyn. He ate there regularly, often sneaking in through the back entrance, sometimes taking food to go. The restaurant couldn't get a liquor license in Gravano's name, for obvious reasons, so Deborah held all the paperwork. But everyone knew who really ran the place. Gravano also set up another company called Marathon Development, a construction firm. It was the same name he'd used in New York for one of his mob-controlled businesses, a fact that should have concerned him but apparently didn't. He was proud of his past, even as he tried to escape it. And that pride, that inability to fully leave Sammy the Bull behind, would be his undoing. Because Salvatore Gravano had a secret that he couldn't keep. He was famous, and he wanted people to know it. By 1997, just 2 years after arriving in Arizona, his identity was an open secret. A local newspaper had disclosed who he really was, confirming what many suspected. Instead of retreating, instead of moving again, instead of doing anything a rational person in witness protection would do, Gravano embraced the attention. He gave interviews. He consulted with author Peter Maas on a biographical book called Underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano's Story of Life in the Mafia, which was published in 1997 to enormous success. He sold the rights to his life story for a television movie called Witness to the Mob, which aired on NBC in 1998. The money was good, book deals, movie deals. He was flush with cash again, though nothing like the $45,000 per week he'd been making in his prime as a Gambino underboss. And the notoriety brought him something he'd craved even more than money: attention. In cafes and restaurants around Phoenix, Gravano would hold court, talking to anyone who would listen about the Mafia, about John Gotti, about the murders he'd committed. He gained a small but loyal following of young local kids who were mesmerized by this real-life gangster in their midst. He offered them advice, friendship, war stories from a life most of them couldn't imagine. Among these young admirers was a 23-year-old named Michael Papa. Michael Papa was not your typical street thug. He was a pre-med student at Arizona State University, on the dean's list, smart enough to have a future in medicine if he wanted it. But Papa had another side. He was one of the founding members of a group that went by various names: Hitler's Youth, White Power, or Devil Dogs, purportedly a racist high school gang that had terrorized the Phoenix suburb of Gilbert. In truth, police sources would later say the gang was really a steroid-laced football team gone bad from lack of direction. They were bad, but they weren't actually racist. Hell, there were even black members, one cop would explain. What they were was directionless, aggressive, looking for something to prove. And when Papa met Sammy the Bull Gravano, when he started working for Creative Pools, when he began spending time at the small brown office of Marathon Development listening to stories about life in the Gambino family, he found exactly what he'd been searching for: a mentor, a teacher, someone who could show him how to be a real gangster. Of all the acolytes, Papa was the most like Sammy the Bull himself. He had the same swagger, the same hunger for respect, the same willingness to use violence to get what he wanted. And he had an entrepreneurial opportunity that was just beginning to explode across Arizona: ecstasy. The drug arrived in Phoenix quietly, almost innocuously. Small bags, brought by friends to share at secretive, insular clubs around the city. It was nothing big at first, just something that like-minded friends would pass among themselves while dancing away weekends at underground raves. These weren't your typical nightclubs. They were spontaneous gatherings in warehouses, in desert lots, in abandoned buildings, advertised only through word of mouth or cryptic flyers. The scene was new age, hippie-ish, friendly. Everyone dressed alike and thought alike. Everyone knew each other. Very cool, very mellow. As one participant would later recall with nostalgia, parents would drop their kids off thinking everything was okay because the venues didn't serve alcohol. The Phoenix Narcotics Squad didn't even know ecstasy was in their city. "We didn't even know it was here," one cop admitted. "It is not a 911 drug." But then, around 1998 and 1999, something changed. The rave scene began to grow. It used to be everyone that showed up dressed alike and thought alike, that same participant explained. Then it just started to grow. People from the university would show up. Jocks would be there. It was like everybody was doing it. As the scene exploded, so did demand for the little pills that made the music sound better, that made dancing feel transcendent, that turned a Saturday night into an unforgettable experience. And Michael Papa, with his connections in Las Vegas and his growing network of former high school friends, saw a business opportunity. He started small: 100 pills here, another 100 there, low-grade ecstasy purchased from a supplier in Las Vegas, distributed at clubs and parties around Phoenix. The profit margins were enormous. Pills that cost $5 wholesale sold for $20, $25, sometimes $30 each. And the customers kept coming back. Papa began to make real money. He bought himself a silver BMW M3, the kind of car that turned heads, that announced success. He started hanging out at upscale clubs, sitting at his own choice table, a young man who suddenly had money and status and connections. But he was still small-time, still just another dealer in a growing market. That changed when he brought Sammy the Bull into the operation. The exact timeline is unclear, but sometime in late 1999, as Gravano's construction business struggled and his pool company failed to generate the income he needed, Papa approached his mentor with a proposition. According to police, who would later surveil the entire organization, Gravano didn't just join the operation, he transformed it. He brought organization, discipline, and the kind of ruthless business acumen that had made him millions in New York. He taught Papa and his crew how to operate like a real criminal enterprise. They changed methods, became more aggressive, showed a lot of force, and were more organized, a Phoenix police spokesman would later explain. It was almost like they were being schooled. They started carrying guns. They used Gravano's name to intimidate other dealers. And most importantly, they scaled up. By late 1999 and early 2000, the operation had transformed from one of hundreds of small rings to the dominant ecstasy supplier in Arizona. The numbers were staggering. At its peak, the ring was selling 30,000 pills per week. 30,000. Every single week. At an average price of $20 per pill, that's $600,000 in weekly revenue. Even accounting for wholesale costs, the operation was netting approximately $500,000 per week in pure profit. Nearly $1 million every single month. The money came in so fast they could barely count it. They stored stacks of cash at the Secretariat Drive House, in the garage, in bedrooms, anywhere they could find space. Police would later discover nearly $100,000 in cash during their raids, but that was just what happened to be on hand at that particular moment. The real money, the millions that flowed through the operation over those 6 or 7 months at the end of 1999 and the beginning of 2000, went into cars, into jewelry, into living expenses, into Papa's BMW and Gravano's Lexus, and the lifestyle they'd both come to enjoy. And every pill was distributed through a network that included some very familiar locations. Uncle Sal's Italian Ristorante in Scottsdale, the family business run by Gravano's ex-wife Deborah, became more than just a place to eat pasta. Among the spots the gang used for dealing ecstasy was Uncle Sal's, according to police surveillance reports. The restaurant, with its motto about being the best-kept secret in Scottsdale, was hiding a very different kind of secret. It's unclear whether Deborah knew the full extent of what was happening in her parking lot, in her back rooms, but police watched as couriers came and went, as transactions took place, as the restaurant became a hub in a network that stretched across Arizona and into neighboring states. Meanwhile, at Creative Pools and Marathon Development, Gravano held meetings with Papa and other members of the crew. He used his own home telephone to coordinate deliveries and discuss business, incredibly, never even bothering to speak in code. He drove his flashy Lexus to meetings, making himself conspicuous instead of invisible. He kept records of transactions lying around his office and his home. For a man who had spent decades in organized crime, who had survived multiple FBI investigations in New York, who knew firsthand how wiretaps and surveillance worked, Sammy the Bull Gravano was making catastrophic operational errors. He seems to have forgotten all he learned, a DEA source would later theorize. He just did everything wrong. He used his own house for meetings and to store drugs. He used his own telephone without even trying to use code words. He left records of the transactions around. He used his wife to monitor the money and kids to run the operation. He prided himself on being a mobster, but he sure forgot what John Gotti taught him. But Gravano wasn't the only one making mistakes. Michael Papa, for all his intelligence, for all his success at Arizona State, was also getting sloppy. He flashed his money too openly. He talked too much. He trusted too many people. And in the fall of 1999, one of those people got caught. The Phoenix Police Department, which had largely been focused on marijuana and cocaine coming across the border from Mexico, suddenly started hearing reports about ecstasy everywhere. Only 1,000 ecstasy pills had been seized in all of Arizona the previous year. Now cops were finding it at parties, in cars, in apartments across the Phoenix metropolitan area. They sent in a young female undercover detective to start making buys at raves and clubs. We had to tell her to stop. She was getting so much, a law enforcement source would later recall. As the detective climbed the distribution ladder, making bigger buys, getting introduced to higher-level dealers, one name kept coming up over and over: Gravano. At first, the officers didn't believe it. Sammy the Bull? The mob turncoat? Living in Arizona and dealing ecstasy? But then, something else happened that confirmed their suspicions. The Drug Enforcement Administration intercepted a large Federal Express shipment of ecstasy in San Francisco. When agents arrested the dealer, facing serious prison time, he mentioned a name that stopped the feds in their tracks: Gravano. The DEA and Phoenix Police formed a joint task force. The investigation began in October 1999 and would continue until the arrests in February 2000. For 4 months, law enforcement shadowed virtually every move Gravano and Papa made. They followed the silver BMW and the Lexus. They watched meetings in restaurant parking lots. They observed handoffs in the Marathon Development office. They monitored Uncle Sal's. And most importantly, they tapped the phones. 16,000 conversations. That's how many phone calls were intercepted during the investigation. 16,000 times that Salvatore Gravano, or Michael Papa, or Gerard Gravano, or one of the dozens of people in their network picked up a telephone and discussed their drug operation, apparently oblivious to the fact that every word was being recorded. The conversations were shockingly unguarded. There was no code, no subterfuge, no operational security of any kind. They talked about pills, about deliveries, about money, about problems with suppliers, about competition from other dealers. They discussed everything a prosecutor would need to build an airtight case. But the surveillance went beyond just wiretaps. Undercover officers made controlled buys. Informants reported back on meetings and transactions. Agents tracked bank accounts and cash deposits. They documented every member of the organization, from the street-level dealers to the suppliers, to the couriers, to Papa and Gravano at the top. And on February 23rd, 2000, after months of preparation, after assembling enough evidence to ensure convictions, after coordinating with federal prosecutors and state authorities, the task force finalized their plan for the morning raids. 47 people would be arrested simultaneously. The entire network would be taken down in a single coordinated strike. And Sammy the Bull Gravano, the man who had destroyed the Gambino crime family, was about to learn what it felt like to be on the receiving end. When the door of the Secretariat Drive house burst open at 6 a.m. on February 24th, Gravano's reaction was pure shock. He scrambled for clothes. He asked what was happening. He demanded to speak to a lawyer, but there was no negotiation, no discussion, no way out. The evidence was overwhelming. Nearly $100,000 in cash was found in the house, stacked in various rooms, some of it still in bank wrappers. Ecstasy pills were discovered, along with packaging materials and records. Guns were seized, though Gravano would later insist he only kept marijuana and Viagra in his personal apartment, not ecstasy. His ex-wife, Deborah, was arrested. His daughter Karen, 27 years old, was arrested. His son Gerard, 24, was arrested. Karen's fiancé, David Seabrook, was arrested. Michael Papa was arrested. 42 others across the Phoenix area were arrested in simultaneous raids. The entire organization was dismantled in a matter of hours. When the booking photo was taken later that day, Salvatore Gravano looked exhausted, defeated, older than his 54 years. The man who had testified against John Gotti with such confidence, such arrogance, such certainty that he was making the smart play, now faced charges that could send him to prison for the rest of his life. His bail was set at $5 million, an amount he couldn't possibly make. He would remain in Maricopa County Jail while prosecutors prepared their case. The charges were devastating. On March 7, 2000, Arizona state prosecutors unveiled a 201-count indictment. 201 counts. The charges included conspiracy to distribute dangerous drugs, money laundering, operating a criminal enterprise, and dozens of individual counts related to specific transactions and deliveries. Federal prosecutors also got involved, filing their own superseding indictment in December 2000 that accused Gravano of buying and distributing thousands of ecstasy tablets. The evidence was overwhelming. The wiretaps alone were damning. But prosecutors also had surveillance footage, testimony from undercover officers, financial records, physical evidence seized from multiple locations, and a parade of lower-level dealers willing to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Gravano's attorney tried to argue that his client had been a mentor to these young men, but not the mastermind of the drug operation. There's a big difference between mentoring kids and masterminding a drug operation, the defense lawyer argued. But the wiretaps told a different story. They showed Gravano discussing pills, money, and operations. They showed him making decisions. They showed him in charge. And Michael Papa, facing his own lengthy prison sentence, began cooperating with authorities, providing details about how Gravano had transformed their small operation into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Deborah Gravano also cooperated, though the extent of her involvement was never fully established. Karen Gravano faced charges as well, though her role appeared to be more peripheral. Gerard Gravano, on the other hand, was deeply involved, and prosecutors made clear he would face serious prison time. For more than a year, Salvatore Gravano sat in jail while his attorneys fought to suppress the wiretap evidence, to challenge the search warrants, to find any legal avenue that might give him leverage. But in June of 2001, reality set in. The evidence was too strong. The witnesses were too numerous. The recordings were too clear. On June 29, 2001, Gravano stood before a judge and pleaded guilty to 10 felony counts, including drug dealing and money laundering. His wife Deborah pleaded guilty to 1 felony count and received probation. His daughter Karen pleaded guilty to 1 felony count and also received probation. But Sammy and Gerard would not be so fortunate. The sentencing took over a year to finalize, as federal and state prosecutors coordinated their cases. On September 6, 2002, in federal court in Brooklyn, the same courthouse where Gravano had testified against John Gotti a decade earlier, a judge sentenced him to 20 years in federal prison. Then, on October 30th, 2002, an Arizona state judge added another 19 years to run concurrently with the federal sentence. Additionally, Gravano was ordered to pay a $100,000 fine and was sentenced to lifetime supervised release, meaning he would be on parole for the rest of his life if he ever got out. Gerard Gravano received 9 years in prison for his role in the ecstasy ring. Michael Papa also received a lengthy sentence. The once promising pre-med student on the dean's list at Arizona State would spend the next several years in prison, his medical career over before it began. The years in prison were hard on Salvatore Gravano. He was transferred between federal facilities, spending time in high-security units where other inmates knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. Rats are not popular in prison, especially rats who testified against the mob. He survived, but the experience aged him. His health declined. In 2015, he filed a motion for sentence reduction, arguing that he'd already served enough time and that his cooperation against the mob should count for something. A federal judge rebuked the motion, essentially telling Gravano that he'd already gotten one sweet deal for the Gotti testimony and he shouldn't expect another. The ecstasy conviction was a separate matter, and he would serve the full sentence. But something changed, whether it was prison overcrowding, good behavior, or some behind-the-scenes legal maneuvering that never became public. Salvatore Gravano was released early. On September 18, 2017, after serving 15 years of his 20-year sentence, he walked out of federal custody. He was 72 years old. The Brooklyn native who had ruled the Gambino family, who had helped murder 19 people, who had destroyed the American Mafia's most powerful boss, who had been given a second chance and blown it by building a drug empire, was finally free. Sort of. The terms of his release were strict: lifetime federal parole, regular check-ins with a parole officer, restrictions on travel, on association, on employment. And he would remain under Arizona state supervision until March 2019. He was not allowed to leave the state without permission. He could not associate with known criminals. He could not profit from his criminal history, though that rule proved harder to enforce in the age of social media and podcasts. Gravano returned to Arizona, though not to the mansion on Secretariat Drive. That property had been seized and sold off long ago, the proceeds going to the state. Uncle Sal's restaurant was no longer owned by the Gravano family. Though it continues to operate under different ownership, its mob history now part of its marketing mystique. The pool company was long defunct. The construction business was gone. Everything Gravano had built in Arizona during those 5 years, from 1995 to 2000, had been dismantled, sold, or appropriated by the government. He moved into a modest bungalow, the sort of place a 20-something bachelor would call home, as one reporter described it. Nothing like the sprawling estate he'd once owned. But Gravano was not done being famous. He started a podcast called Our Thing, where he discussed mob history, his time in the life, and the events that led to his testimony against Gotti. He gave interviews to journalists, appeared in documentaries, and slowly rebuilt a public persona as a mob expert and survivor. His daughter Karen became a reality television star on VH1's Mob Wives, which ran from 2011 to 2016. She also wrote a memoir called Mob Daughter, published in 2012, detailing what it was like growing up as Sammy the Bull's child. In 2025, a documentary called Sons of Ecstasy premiered on HBO Max, telling the story of the Arizona ecstasy operation from the perspective of Gravano and his family. In the documentary's preview, Gerard Gravano says, "It's the story we never allowed my father to tell. The irony was inescapable. Even after everything, after 19 murders and 37 mob convictions and a drug empire and 20 years in prison, the Gravano family was still finding ways to profit from their notoriety." But what about the victims? What about the families of the 19 men Salvatore Gravano murdered or helped murder? What about Eddie Garofalo, killed on Gravano's orders, whose daughter Laura has spoken publicly about the pain of knowing her father's killer, got a sweetheart deal and is now free? What about all the young people in Arizona who got hooked on ecstasy, some of whom suffered long-term consequences, some of whom died? What about the police officers and prosecutors who spent months building cases only to watch Gravano and his family eventually return to public life, giving interviews, doing podcasts, appearing in documentaries? The truth is that Salvatore Gravano represents something deeply troubling about the American criminal justice system's relationship with organized crime. He committed 19 murders and served less than 5 years. He built a drug empire worth millions and served 15. His lifetime sentence, if you add it all up, amounts to roughly 20 years for everything, 1 year per murder more or less. And now, at 80 years old, he's a celebrity of sorts, living in Arizona, telling stories about the old days to anyone who will listen, monetizing his infamy in an age where infamy and fame are increasingly indistinguishable. His property on Secretariat Drive, that $650,000 symbol of his second chance, is long gone. Whoever owns it now lives there without knowing that every room once held cash from a drug operation, that the pool with the custom waterfall was paid for with blood money, that the stables and the 3-car garage and the 8 bedrooms were all part of a fantasy that lasted exactly 5 years before collapsing into ruin. John Gotti died in prison, bitter and betrayed, insisting until his last breath that Sammy the Bull Gravano was a liar and a traitor. He never got to see Gravano arrested on drug charges, never got to savor the irony of the rat getting caught again, never got the satisfaction of knowing that the man who destroyed him couldn't stay out of trouble even with a new life, handed to him on a silver platter. Gotti went to his grave believing he'd been the smart one, the loyal one, the one who kept the code. But Gravano is the one who's still alive, still telling stories, still making money, still, in some perverse way, winning. The mansion in Arizona was supposed to be his escape, his redemption, his proof that he could leave the life behind and become someone else. Instead, it became a crime scene, a symbol of hubris, a reminder that some people can never change. The property is just a house now, occupied by people with no connection to its history. The pool still has its waterfall, the stables still stand, the 3-car garage still opens and closes. But the ghosts are there, invisible to the current owners, but there nonetheless. The ghost of Sammy the Bull at his peak, thinking he'd gotten away with it all. The ghost of Michael Papa, a smart kid who threw away his future. The ghosts of 47 arrested lives, some of them ruined forever by a few months in the Arizona sun. The last great irony of the Salvatore Gravano story is that his greatest mistake in Arizona wasn't getting involved in the ecstasy business. It was forgetting the most basic rule of his old life. Never, ever believe you're untouchable. In New York in the 1980s, when he was making $45,000 a week and running construction rackets and ordering murders, he knew he was being watched. He knew the FBI was out there. He knew to be careful, to be smart, to assume every room was bugged and every phone was tapped. But in Arizona, in that beautiful house on Secretariat Drive, with the desert sun shining and legitimate businesses in his name and his face on book covers and television screens, he forgot. He thought he was safe. He thought he was above it all. He used his real name, his real house, his real businesses. He talked openly about being Sammy the Bull. He mentored young criminals in broad daylight. And when Michael Papa came to him with an opportunity to make real money again, to feel that rush of criminal enterprise, to be the boss of something, he couldn't resist. The house on Secretariat Drive was more than just a property. It was a symbol of everything Sammy the Bull wanted to be and could never become: a legitimate businessman, a family man, a success story. Instead, it became the headquarters of a drug ring that would ultimately send him back to prison for another 15 years. And somewhere, in whatever passes for the afterlife in mobster mythology, John Gotti must be laughing. The Secretariat Drive mansion, that $650,000 dream, sits quietly now in its Tempe neighborhood, no different from the houses around it, except for its history. The current owners probably have no idea that federal agents once burst through that front door at 6 a.m. They probably don't know that nearly $100,000 in cash was seized from their bedrooms. They probably never heard of Salvatore Gravano or Michael Papa or the ecstasy ring that once operated out of their garage. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe that's how it should be. The house was always just a house. The stables were always just stables. The pool with the waterfall was always just concrete and water. It was Sammy the Bull who made it something more, who turned it into a symbol, who filled it with cash and drugs and the same criminal ambition that had defined his entire life. And it was Sammy the Bull who destroyed it, who ensured that his name would be forever associated with that address, that property, that spectacular failure. He tried to escape his past. He tried to become someone else. But in the end, the past caught up with him exactly where he thought he was safest: in his own home, surrounded by his family, with his name on the door.